Hello, hello. Welcome back to Loki's Librarian. I am your librarian, Katrina. If you are new here, welcome. Nice to meet you. This is where I'm reading through the enormous library of books you see on the wall behind you, and then I give you a quick synopsis and I tell you what I think about them. So if you like books and just aren't sure what to read next, hit that subscribe button, like and share my videos. Let me know what you think in the comments. Now, it is the last Sunday of the month, and I reserve the last Sunday of the month for learning about the presidents of these United States. Last month, we left off with the sudden death of the 9th President, William Henry Harrison. So this month, we are moving on to number 10, Vice President turned President John Tyler, with this week's book of the week, President Without a Party, The Life of John Tyler by Christopher J. Leahy. And since I started adding topical cocktails, I will be mixing up a dark horse cocktail this week. The reason for the dark horse designation will be clear by the end of the review, I hope. Now, let's do this. Real quick, this is an oddly specific cocktail as far as measurements go. It's not like ounces or shots, it's tablespoons. So bear with me while I get really weird with my pours here. So, John Tyler was born March 29th, 1790 at Greenway Plantation in Charles City County, Virginia. He was heavily influenced by his father growing up, adopting a lot of his father's beliefs about the country, the Constitution, and what constituted right and wrong. Now, there is nothing inherently bad about any of that. Most people inherit their parents' political leanings and ideologies, thoughts, rights, and wrongs. A lot of that is inherited until you get out in the world, so there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But it seems like to Judge John Tyler was like a genuine hero. I mean, he did his part during the American Revolution. He fought in the Continental Congress, or the Continental Army, and then he served in the Continental Congress. Ultimately, he played a part in Virginia ratifying Convention of 1788. Judge Tyler did not want to join the Union. He was anti-federalist when the Constitution was adopted and we became a nation. He became a anti-federalist, strict constitutionalist, very much in line with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And all of that poured down into John Tyler, and he kind of adopted those as well when he was growing up. Get started with my oddly specific cocktail here. We start with 2 tablespoons of rum. Again, not sponsored, just what I happen to have on hand. So 2 tablespoons of rum. Probably could have found like a calculator to tell me how much a tablespoon was in an ounce, but we're just going to go with it. Now, John Tyler, he was a pretty bright kid. He was accepted into the College of William and Mary at 14, which was young even for those days. He graduated at 17 and passed the bar for Virginia at 19, which was technically 2 years too young, but since he passed, he was qualified and he began practicing law. We have 2 tablespoons of either kahlua or coffee liqueur. Since I had coffee liqueur on hand, I went with what I had on hand. So he spent a few years building a fairly successful law practice. I mean, he was becoming well known, and not just because his father was Judge John Tyler, but in his own right. We do 2 tablespoons of the coffee liqueur. So he's practicing law. He's kind of not quite following his dad's footsteps. His dad became a judge. Ultimately, his dad did become a federal judge for the United States. John Tyler went into politics. Now, this may or may not have been at the urging of his father. Regardless, once he was in, he found a genuine liking for it. Okay, so he spent a few years building his law career before he jumped with both feet into politics, becoming a member of the House of Representatives in 1816. So he was 26 at this time. And he served there until 1821 and took a mini retirement because of health reasons. I mean, basically, it was so stressful to him that he was having stomach problems and like dizzy spells. No idea what was really going on there, but it was affecting his health, and so he ended up sort of retiring. Now, in the middle of just before he joined politics, he married his first wife, Letitia Christian Tyler, in 1813, and they ultimately had 8 children together. Maybe 9. If there was a 9th that died in infancy, and there was no name ever recorded, there's no record of it beyond basically a vague mention of a baby by one of his sons that died in childbirth. So he had 8 children by Letitia that survived to adulthood, which is astounding given that while he was arguably landed gentry in Virginia, he was not good with money. And at one point, and this is ironic because his fiscal policy ends up being fairly sound while he's president, but he himself was bad with money. It's like me when I, play video games. I can save money until I have millions of dollars, but in reality, it's just not quite so easy. At one point, he ended up having to sell some of his slaves in order to have money that he needed to go to Washington to actually do the job for which he was elected. This was when he was made senator. Politically, though, he was highly principled. I mean, he firmly believed in states' rights, and he was against the national bank, ideals that he held and consistently supported throughout his entire political career. He was a logically consistent man, and when he was voted into the House of Representatives, one of the first things he did was vote to repeal a measure Congress had just passed, which gave themselves a pay raise. Weirdly enough, their constituents were like, no, you don't get to just vote yourself money, and there was much rabble-rousing, and Tyler believed that, weirdly, you work for the people when you're in Congress, and if they don't think you should have a pay raise, then you should not be voting yourself a pay raise, which, I mean, Jesus, congressmen today could take a page from his book, because that's just unheard of. Actually thinking that your constituents have the right to tell you what to do is wild, and it just gets crazier from here. So he voted to repeal this particular law, and he also voted that you work for the people. If they tell you how to vote, you need to vote what they tell you to vote, right? So weird. So he's a member of Congress from 1860 until he retired for health reasons in 1821. And he set about rebuilding his law practice, which he had abandoned when he joined Congress. And then in 1825, he was voted in as governor of Virginia, and he served for 2 years. I think at this time they only had 1-year terms, so he was voted in twice technically, at which point he was appointed senator from Virginia. Now remember, at this point in time, senator was not voted directly by the people. It was appointed by the governing bodies of the state. The state of Virginia sent him back to Washington, this time as a senator. I need a teaspoon of vermouth. I told you, it's a weirdly specific drink. So he's sent back to Washington, this time as senator, and he serves as senator from 1827 until 1836 when he resigns on principle. Now we're going to get to that principle as soon as I pour this teaspoon. And a dash of lemon. So I'm just going to, I still have some fresh lemon here. We're just going to squeeze a little dash in there. And that's the cocktail so far. We're going to mix it up. Let me do this. Good, the copper one gets even colder than the steel one. Okay. Voted in as senator from Virginia, he returns to Washington, serves as senator from 1827 until 1836 when he resigns on principle. Now, okay, this says serve over a champagne flute. I don't have a champagne flute. I am not that fancy. I did manage to dig up some wine glasses last week, so we're going to put this in here. Now I'm understanding the tiny little measurements now. I'm supposed to top it off with Coca-Cola. Not a whole lot of room to top off with Coca-Cola on this bad boy. Garnish with lemon, but I think there's not enough room for a garnish of lemon right now, so I'm just going to leave it like that. So, remember back when I did the video on Andrew Jackson, and I relayed how Jackson was censured by the Senate for his actions regarding the National Bank? Well, however much Tyler hated the National Bank, and he did, he thought that that was absolutely against the Constitution and what was allowed. He thought Jackson's handling of the matter was appalling and a violation of the executive mandates as set forth in the Constitution. Remember, Tyler is a strict constitutionalist. He's a constructionist. He thinks that how the Constitution was written is what the founders meant. This is what was meant. This is what should be done. And he followed that. So when Jackson's handling of the banking situation was so appalling in 1834, he voted for the censure. And a few years later, when the Senate looked to remove that censure from the books, Tyler disagreed. He said, no, we were absolutely right to censure him. He was grossly overstepping bounds of executive authority. And the state of Virginia, his constituents, insisted that he vote to overturn the censure. And Tyler kind of realized at this point he's been backed into a corner. I mean, when he started his political career, he made such a fuss over how the electorate were the true bosses. They were the bosses of the elected officials, and the electorate can tell you what to do and how to cast your vote, and the electorate were insisting that he overturn the censure. But his own morals were saying, no, we were right to censure him, so what's he going to do, right? Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I'm liking dark horses. So what does he do? Does he follow his own words and do as the bosses, as we the people have told him to do? Or does he follow his principle, which says the censure should stand because Jackson was a ham-fisted jackass who grossly overreached the presidential authority? He found a third path, and he resigned. He could have simply stood his ground and said no, but that would have made him an absolute hypocrite for having insisted the electorate could direct his vote and then voting against how they insisted that he vote. And he could have simply voted the way he was directed, declaring that his hands were tied, but that would have been to betray his own morals. And so, being a man of principle, he did neither, and he resigned, rather than corrupt his own sense of right and wrong. Remarkable. He's a freaking hero. That was 1836, and again, he intended to retire from politics at this time. He moved his family to Williamsburg, Virginia, with the intention of starting up his law practice, Williamsburg being a much better location than a farm in the middle of nowhere. So he goes to Williamsburg, and that's where he's at, and he's practicing law when he is tapped by the Whig Party to run as vice president for William Henry Harrison. I don't think he was necessarily anybody's first pick for vice presidential candidate, but he was a good pick because Harrison had that war hero credibility from the Tippecanoe incident. And Tyler had his strict constructionist principles that were unquestionable. And following his retirement from the Senate, they were unimpeachable. I mean, everybody knew he was going to do what he said he was going to do. I mean, he had found the path he believed was right, and he was going to walk that straight and narrow. So the 1840 campaign kicks off, and it's a genuine circus. You know, Tippecanoe and Tyler, too, became known as the log cabin campaign, log cabin and hard cider, and that's what they did. They would literally erect log cabins wherever they were giving speeches, and since they were campaigning during the financial panic brought about by Jackson's and Van Buren's policies, they won quite handily. Tyler was sworn in as vice president on March 4th, 1841, and immediately returned to Williamsburg because at this point in history, the vice president's one job is to cast a tie-breaking vote in the Senate should such a thing occur. And since the Senate was currently in recess, he had nothing else to do, so he returned to his family in Williamsburg, and he was asleep in bed at 4:30 a.m. on April 5th, 1841, when he was woken up by an urgent messenger from D.C., advising him that William Henry Harrison had died and Tyler was needed in D.C. immediately to take the place of acting president. Now, that's very important, all right? At this point in history, this is uncharted territory, all right? The Constitution allows for the election of president and vice president in tandem. It actually does not specify that the vice president takes over on the president's death, right? Didn't know that. I honestly didn't know that until I read this book. I was like, huh. But he's right. The author's right. Article 2, Section 1 just reads, for the president, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. He shall hold this office during the term of 4 years, and, together with the vice president chosen for the same term, be elected as follows. Each state shall appoint in manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. Nowhere in there does it actually say the vice president takes over if the president dies or is suddenly incapacitated. In fact, author Christopher Leahy points out correctly that the vice president becoming president on the incapacitation of the president doesn't actually become law until the passage of the 25th Amendment on February 10th, 1967. Tyler interpreted Article 2, Section 1 to mean that he inherited the office on Harrison's death, but no such actual provision existed at that time. Because I genuinely think that if he hadn't had such a strict constructionist history behind him, he might have gotten a bit more pushback from the Senate with what he did next. But because he was so strict in how he interpreted the Constitution, always in line with what the Constitution said, they had no reason to misdoubt his credibility at this time. So when he interpreted it to mean that he inherited the position, he went straight to D.C., where he insisted that he take the oath of office as sworn by the president. And they just basically presented a fait accompli to the Senate when they managed to convene an emergency session a few weeks later. And the Senate and Congress debated the legality of his actions and ultimately decided that he was correct, because we have to have a president. What's the point of a vice president if you're not going to have him step in should the metaphorical shit hit the fan, right? However, Tyler never elected a new VP to fill his now vacant role, which left the Senate to be run by Senate President pro tempore. Now, luckily for Tyler, there were no ties that needed to be broken during the Senate during his years in office. And because he acted so quickly, his actions set the precedence which would be followed by vice presidents up until the ratification of the 25th Amendment, 125 years, 10 months, and like 5 days after Tyler set that precedence. So when Fillmore takes over, when, what was it, Johnson takes over after Lincoln, you know, technically when Lyndon B. Johnson takes over from Kennedy, there was no law saying he could actually do that. It wasn't until the passage of the 25th Amendment that that became a thing. I really got to get a new camera. Sorry about that. It tends to do that after X period of minutes, but it varies. Like sometimes I can get through the whole recording, and other times, like 10 minutes in, it'll do that. So I don't know. So he's now president. He acted decisively. He insisted that he be sworn in. He took the oath of office. The Senate and Congress eventually said, okay, sure, he's the president. So what does a president who was never meant to be president do once he is sworn the oath of office? Well, he started off by pissing off his cabinet. He inherited a cabinet from Harrison, and he wasn't going to kick any of them out at this point in time. He's like, okay, yeah, this isn't going to happen. We're going to do this. So the presidential cabinet tried to convince Tyler that Harrison had agreed to rule by consensus. Basically, whatever the cabinet decided on, Harrison would do. And Tyler's like, no. That may have been what Harrison said to do. I don't know. I wasn't here for those conversations, but that's not what I'm going to do. I'm the president. Whatever happens out there, I'm the one who's going to take the blame and the fall for this, which means I need to be okay with the decisions that are made by this cabinet. And so, no, we're not going to be ruling by consensus. And he then continued the trend by pissing off his political party. And he did that by refusing to sign into law the bank bill that they kept trying to pass. That same bank bill that he was absolutely against when Jackson managed to get it, repealed. They tried to present him with a new one. He's like, no, I'm not going to sign that. And he vetoed it twice. And Henry Clay, the leader of the Whig Party, lost his mind. He was furious about this. He was so mad that ultimately by the end of 1841, he had gathered all the Whigs together and they had kicked John Tyler out of the party. So he now became the president without a party, hence the name of the book. And he had no political party for the entire rest of the 3 years that he was in office. And in fact, his entire cabinet resigned at this point because they were all good, staunch Whigs. And so everybody abandoned him. And he served the remainder of his presidency without political backing. This, incidentally, is a solid path to conflict and hell. He did not have an easy 3 years in office there. He did try to work with the Whigs. He presented an exchequer plan, which basically is the forerunner to the Fed. He wanted to create a centralized government agency that would regulate the circulation of the nation's currency, like the Federal Reserve. So that was, 70 years ahead of its time, though. But this was interesting because, and this is a quote directly from the book, and this is really on point. So he wanted to create this sort of centralized circulation for the money. Paradoxically, however, Tyler's contention that people should not rely on the government for their financial well-being and that instead industry and frugality, not the circulation of paper money, were the keys to prosperity, reflects the views of some 21st century opponents of the Fed. Yes, it does. Hence the dark horse cocktail. I knew basically nothing about Tyler before reading this book. I mean, literally nothing. I knew that he had inherited the presidency from Harrison, and I only knew that because I had to come up with the list of presidents. Otherwise, I had no idea who took over from Harrison. And out of nowhere, with his strong stance on states' rights, his strict constructionist reading of the Constitution, and his hatred of central banking, he is a dark horse contender for favorite president ever. But wait, there's more. Because he did inherit a country in a financial crisis. And he recognized that the country was running at an extreme deficit. But for all that, he pushed back against Congress wanting to raise the tariff. So he knows we need money, but Congress wanted to raise the tariff, and he said, no, why don't you cut spending? I love this guy. I mean, maybe don't build those roads you guys are so keen to build for internal improvement. So basically, he started his career by voting to repeal a self-granted pay raise for which he did not vote in the first place, but which certainly would have benefited him. He refuses to raise taxes, advocates for personal fiscal responsibility, and thinks that the way to benefit the country is not to raise taxes, but to cut spending. This guy's a libertarian wet dream, except for the whole slave owning thing, and he was a slave owner. That's a serious monkey wrench being thrown into the favorite works. I mean, you shouldn't judge people based on a 200-year time difference, but we all do. And yeah, he was not necessarily the bestest of slave owners anyways. There's some indication that he may have underfed his servants, slaves. Anyways, there's nothing good about slavery. Trying to pretend there is some sort of beneficent good to it is just, it's backwards. It's medieval. Anyways, back to the book. In 1842, so this is about a year after he's sworn into office, you have Thomas Wilson Dorr of Rhode Island was pushing to overhaul that state's charter. This goes more into why Tyler was kind of awesome. See, alone of the original 13 states, Rhode Island had not created a state constitution. Interesting, right? They chose instead to run off the state's original 1663 royal charter. There's nothing that said they couldn't do this. This was absolutely in par with, each state has their own, and then we all come together federally. But as a consequence, only about 40% of the white male population was allowed to vote. Basically, you had to actually own land to vote in this state, and most of the population did not. So Thomas Wilson Dorr tried to change that, and the landed gentry, headed by Governor King, flipped their metaphorical shit. They pushed Dorr basically set out his own constitutional convention, had his own government running in tandem where he was voted the governor, and Governor King didn't like that, and both parties were sending people out to the president saying, hey, back us, back us, back us. And Tyler actually backed King because that was logically consistent, on par with the Constitution. Each state creates their own, and then they work together. And for better or for worse, no matter how much popular support Dorr had, he had not passed this legitimately in the state of Rhode Island. Tyler, while he agreed with the landed gentry, the charter still being their prevailing document on the state level, also acknowledged that Dorr had done nothing inconsistent with the precepts set forth by the U.S. Constitution, because all he had tried to do was get a constitutional convention together for the state, which had the backing of everybody except the landed gentry. And so when Governor King came to him and said, hey, we need troops to back us up because we got this real rebellion, this insurrection fomenting, Tyler said, have they actually rebelled? Because if they haven't actually picked up arms, I'm not going to send troops to you. This is an internal matter. Rhode Island needs to take care of it. Fix your own problem, dude. Stop expecting the federal government to fix your shit for you. Oh, if only we had a time machine. Ultimately, Dorr did get involved, or did take up arms, but he put them down again almost immediately. I mean, well before Tyler could actually send the army, Dorr had put them back down. And he fled the state. Not long after that, in like 1843, Rhode Island actually passed a constitution, and Dorr returned to the state, where he was immediately arrested, tried, and sentenced to a lifetime of hard labor. However, Rhode Island was like, no. He was right, and they rebelled, not armed. They just rebelled, appealed to their congressman or whatever. And Dorr was released after only serving 12 months of his life sentence. But again, Tyler was asked to send troops, and he said, nope, this is an internal matter. You guys take care of it. Can you imagine any politician today doing that, just walking away, having the power to just roll troops in? So domestically, Tyler was not much liked. On foreign policy, he managed to do it better, proving he had some pretty strong diplomatic skills. I mean, he was pretty good with people face to face. He would probably be a nightmare on social media. I'm not saying he's like Trump, because I don't think he would be. I have a feeling he's a little more eloquent, but face to face, he was very good. Remember the War of 1812? Yeah, I know. We're in 1843 at this point, but the War of 1812 ended in 1816 with the Treaty of Ghent. And at that time, the King of the Netherlands offered to act as intermediary in settling the territorial dispute between the United States and Great Britain over the northern border of the United States. 30 years later, that territory was still in dispute. We hadn't actually settled the boundaries at all. Tyler and his then Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, managed to negotiate with the British and settle our northern borders. Settled quite a few things with the British. September 10th, 1842, Letitia Tyler died. She had been sick for his entire tenure. She suffered a stroke in 1839, which left her unable to be the White House hostess. Basically, that job was handled by her daughter-in-law, Priscilla. But they'd been married for 29 years, and Tyler mourned her loss for about 5 months, which seems dreadfully short, But I don't doubt that he loved her. Portraits show that she was a genuinely beautiful woman, but she'd been really sick for 3 years. I mean, she'd had a stroke in 1839, and this isn't, a modern day medicine can have huge advances and you can recover quite well from a stroke, but they didn't have that in 1839. So she became quite ill and was not quite bedridden, but not real mobile either. And he had plenty of time to realize her death was coming. So she dies in September of 42, and he met Julia Gardner in December of 42. And he was quite taken with her, and he proposed marriage in like March of 1843. And Julia initially rejected his proposal, and he continued to court her for over a year. Julia was also quite beautiful, and she was 30 years younger than Tyler. This was not a scandal, believe it or not. Not even a little bit. There were some people who, of course, kind of raised their eyebrows and were like, oh, this can't possibly end well. He's so much older than her. But by all accounts, this was very much a love match on both sides. She ultimately accepted his proposal in 1844, and they were married in secret on June 26, 1844, which was no mean feat, marrying in secret, because he was still president, and she was basically a northern socialite. She lived in New York and was very well known. Her family was very wealthy. So she was first lady for the last 8 months of his being president. In August of 1844, he determined officially not to run, decided that this was it. He was going to have his one term that he inherited. He wasn't going to try and run on his own merit. And he referred all of his close friends and political followers to vote for Democratic nominee James K. Polk. But during his last year in office, and all the way up, even up before August, he was working on annexing Texas, and he wanted that to be his legacy to the United States, was this annexation of Texas. And Texas wanted to be annexed, so it's not like we were, trying to roll troops in. President of Republic of Texas, Sam Houston, had reached out to him and said, hey, Jackson refused, Van Buren refused, will you please annex Texas? And so he worked on it quite diligently. And it was a hard sell because the North was very concerned that if Texas came into the Union, being that it was south of that, 30th parallel, south of the Mason-Dixon line, it could potentially be broken up into 5 states, which would all be slave states joining the Union. Through heavy negotiations, the first steps towards annexation were completed, and ultimately Texas joined the Union as 1 state, not 5. But still, that was his legacy, and he wanted to make very sure that he claimed that legacy. So, let's see here. We had Webster retired as a Secretary of State. So Texas being its own union at this time, its own state, its own nation, we had to work on annexation with their diplomatic corps. So Webster had retired. He had his replacement was Secretary of State Upshur, who had died in an accident, same accident that killed Julia's father, actually. They were commissioning a new ship. It had a new cannon that was made of, I think, wrought iron instead of cast iron, and surprise, surprise, it exploded, killing like 5 people. One of whom was Secretary of State Upshur. So Tyler called in former Vice President, former South Carolina Senator John Calhoun to be his new Secretary of State. Calhoun negotiated those final steps towards bringing Texas into the nation, and Tyler and Calhoun both, at various points in time, claimed Texas as their doing. Anyways, March 4th, 1845, Tyler left the White House, and he retired to his farm, which he had called Sherwood Forest. He and Julia proceeded to have 7 more children. I think at this point in time, with 15 living children and God knows how many grandchildren at this point, he was like the most progenitor president we've ever had. And by all accounts, he was quite content in his retirement. He enjoyed his time with Julia. They traveled to, various spas and resorts for health reasons. And they were enjoying life until November 6th, 1860, at which point Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and a month later South Carolina secedes, followed shortly by Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Tyler proposed at that point having a convention of the border states, like Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, just to see if they could come up with a working option between the Deep South and the northern industrial states. However, the idea got out, and all the states, except for those that had seceded, sent representatives. And as Tyler feared, this became a giant shouting match, with each representative seeking to be the most heard, the one with the biggest ideas and the loudest opinions, because politicians can't fucking help themselves. Tyler sought a meeting with Abraham Lincoln, which was granted. However, Tyler came away convinced that Lincoln would rather have war than allow slavery to continue. And so Tyler, being as logically consistent as ever, voted in favor of states' rights and secession, and became known to history as the traitor president. Which is really awful, because he was such a staunch defender of the Constitution, and that's all he was doing, was defending the Constitution. And nowhere in the Constitution at this point, I have no idea what the idiots in government have done since, but at this point, there was nothing that said a state can't secede if they are unhappy with the Union. In fact, New Hampshire right now is considering secession because they are so unhappy with the Union. But for New Hampshire, it's literally written into their state constitution that they can secede. So again, that won't necessarily, I don't know how that'll play out. But anyways, Tyler, at this point, took a half step back into politics. He was voted to serve in the Provisional Confederate Congress. In 1861, he was voted in. However, on January 18th, 1862, just before the Congress met, he died at age 71, possibly a stroke. And so he, instead of doing anything or being given the chance to reconcile the nation, he went down in history as the traitor president. Maybe I should have found a cocktail called Traitor, but frankly, Dark Horse just fits. I love this guy. I love this guy. This book was quite good. Leahy does a remarkable job in presenting Tyler's mindset and showing his consistent path through history. He points out Tyler's also human failings, the slavery issue most predominantly, without making any excuses for them. He's merely explaining this is what happened at this point in time. And he's just, as best as he's able, he explains it. Leahy's best is excellent. We need more politicians like Tyler today. We need men and women who have not only read the Constitution, but actually understand it and will adhere to its principles. I mean, I think it's disgraceful that Tyler is remembered for treason when his entire history says he could make no other choice. The federal government was overreaching based on the precepts of the Constitution. And he never had. Tyler never would have done that. And he agreed with Jefferson as far as Taylor was an evil, or, oh my God. This is what happens when you mix a cocktail on an empty stomach. Because I didn't have time to eat this morning because I just wrote this up right before recording. So no food, empty stomach, cocktail. Slurring a little bit here. Let's slur some more. He agreed with Jefferson. He thought that slavery was evil, but there was no easy way out of it. For a brief while, he was president of a colonization society. Colonization at the time, what they believed was let's just ship them all back to Africa. Not practical by any metric, because by this point, not inconsiderable number of the slaves, the enslaved people, had actually been born in the United States. So they knew nothing about Africa. Home was here. Why would they want to go back to Africa? So that was an impractical solution that never went anywhere because it was impractical. Everything he did was consistent with the Constitution. That was his guiding star, and he used it as true north, and he followed it to his dying day. Yeah, I still love John Quincy Adams, but I think John Tyler jumped to the top right now because he believed in the Constitution. He thought it was the path that everybody should follow, especially politicians. He thought politicians worked for the people. Damn, that shit doesn't exist anymore. That's it for this week. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'll see you all next week. I'm gonna go have some bacon and eggs, I think, try and absorb some alcohol here, and try and get through the rest of my day. See y'all next week. Bye.